Okay, in this lesson we're going to talk about adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. When we say of all real numbers, we're meaning fractions, decimals, whole numbers. This relates to any of those. But we're going to be dealing with positive and negatives. And we're going to be looking at collecting. Then we're going to move on to applying this to multiplication and division. And there's different rules for each of these. Some of you may, I'm sure probably all of you, have had these rules before. Sometimes students really don't need this lesson. Other times students really do because they've had those rules a little goofy in their head. And it's because, you know, a lot of times they're saying, what the heck? It says subtract, but I'm really adding, or it says add, but I'm really subtracting. You know, because the rules, the math rules have to deal with absolute value, and that gets to be very confusing. So I've kind of changed the way I talk about it. I have been using this for decades. I used to teach junior high students, and I kind of started there, and they really connected to it. So I would like to kind of change the way you think about it. But first of all, right out of the gate, I want to get rid of the whole idea of having double signage, and I want to go to single signage. And by that I mean, sometimes you've seen, you know, this -3 minus, a -7, or let's say a +7. And I call that double signage. That is unnecessary. There's only going to be one place where you're going to have signage like this, where you have double signage, that it's really necessary, and that's the only time I'm going to implement it. So this is what I mean by double signage. I'm going to say we're not going to go with that. Okay, so we're going to forget about adding and subtracting positiveness and negativeness. What I want you to think about is that double signage, and then think about the value, and think about collecting. Later, we're going to think about finding leftovers. But right now, I think the easiest one to start with is when you have the same sign, you add and keep the sign. That's basically what the rule says. But what I want you to think about is collecting, because if you continue on in an algebra class, you start dealing with collecting like terms, collecting variables. That collecting concept comes into play, and it derives from this. So I say, let's start using that term right now. That kind of implies what it is that you're going to be doing. When you're collecting, you're adding them up. So when I have something like -12, and I am trying to collect, you know, a -2 with it, obviously I'm going to be looking at how many negatives do I have total. I have -14. When it's positives, it's just back to your regular old addition. I'm grouping a bunch of positive numbers. This will be +13. And notice very often you won't write the positive there. If there's no sign, it's assumed that it's a positive number. Here I'm collecting a bunch of negatives, and I have -8 along with -5 gives me -13. Here it's good old addition, so that comes out to be +12. Again, I don't have to write the positive. Here I'm collecting a bunch of negatives, and I will have a total of 14 negatives. So again, I was adding and keeping the sign. Here it's good old addition, it comes out to be 9. Now that one's pretty straightforward, and I think everybody's super cool with that. The different sign, again, the rule is subtract and use the sign of the larger number. I want you to think about man-to-man combat, and you're going to be looking at this as which army has more. That concept will, you know, tell you what it is that you need to know. And then you're going to ask yourself how many more will tell you what you need to do to subtract. Okay, so we're going to start in with one. We've got -3, and we're collecting a +7. These have different signs. Now the rule says is that you subtract and take the sign of the larger number. So you'd be saying 7 minus the 3, because you're going to have to subtract the smaller one away from the larger one, and that would give you 4. And because the 7 is larger, it's going to be a +7. Now that's just blind application of the rules. I want you to think about what this actually means. What I'm getting at here, which army has more, I want you to think about you're trying to group or collect, or you're trying to group and collect up some negatives with some positives. So I'm going to write 3 negatives here are going to be collected with 7 positives. So I'm going to draw a picture of all my positives. So I've got 7 positives collected with 3 negatives. This is where the man-to-man combat comes into play. So you can see that these are going to cancel each other out. And so you're going to be thinking, well, then you have 4 left over, and they're all positive. So that's what I'm getting at when I say which army has more, how many more. And that will tell you what to subtract and what your sign's going to be. So this is just straight up subtraction. 9 minus 8 is going to give us 1. And here I have this negative 2 with a positive 5. This is where it gets confusing, when the negative comes before the positive. So you can think of this as grouping. So I have two negatives, and they're going to go to battle with 5 positives. And you can see here that these cancel each other out. Man-to-man combat, the positives are going to win this battle because there's 3 more positives than there are negatives. But again, it's just kind of a funky way to apply that rule. Here we have 4 negatives, and we've gone to battle with 8 positives. These are going to cancel each other out, so we have 4 left over. It's going to be a positive 4. Here this is 6 minus 9, and this is where students sometimes have a little harder time when it's a subtraction, but the second number that we're trying to take away from our positive is larger. So if I draw my positives, I've got 6 positives going to battle with 9 negatives. I can see these are going to cancel out, and I didn't write all my negatives, I'm going to have 3 negatives left over, so that'd be a negative 9. Another way, a lot of times students are comfortable looking at a number line on this. So when I have 6 minus 9, if you draw your number line and then slap down where your 0 is, 6 is going to be over here on the positive side. But we're going to be bouncing back in the negative direction 9 units. I've lost my track as far as how many little humps there I made. But I'm going back in the negative direction 9 units. I'm going to bust past 0 and go from the positive zone into the negative zone. So you're kind of thinking, do I bust past out of the zone from positive to negative? Or if I did this one over here where I was doing negative 3, this problem up here is dealing with 6 minus 9, but this one down here is going to be negative 3 plus 7. I have to identify where my 0 is. So I've identified 0. And negative 3 would be over here. So 1, 2, 3. Here's negative 3. And I'm going to go in the positive direction 7 units. So I'm going to bust out of the negative zone into the positive zone, and I'll land over here with positive 4. So this would be our solution here. So sometimes students like to have a number line, and if you're really fuzzy with this one, I would say, yeah, draw a number line and just kind of figure out where you're at and where you're going, so you kind of develop that intuitive feel. Am I busting out of the negative zone? Am I busting into the other zone? Or, what do I have more of? And that kind of gives you an idea. 10 minus 7 is just going to be the 3. Okay, so those are the 2 basic rules there. I'll let you look at those one more time. And basically, either you have the same sign or you have different signs. Okay, this is the one that gets a little funky. We've got the double negative, and this is where students have a hard time recognizing when this applies. When you are subtracting an already negative number, the double negative becomes positive. The easiest thing that I can relate this to right now, there's a lot of mathematical things that I can relate this to, but I think what you're going to attach to is not a math problem at all. In English, we kind of have this double negative thing. We can't really speak in double negatives or write in double negatives because it becomes kind of confusing. And by a double negative in English, I mean, if I would say, I don't have no lunch today. I don't have no lunch. That's a double negative. I don't have no lunch today really implies that I do have lunch today. So we can't write like that or talk like that in English, and because it's a double negative. Same thing for the math. We can't have double negatives. So when you're subtracting, in this case I've got negative 3. This is not the negative I'm talking about, but negative 3 minus an already negative 7. This is the double negative I'm talking about. You're subtracting an already negative number. You can easily recognize this by 2 negatives separated by a parenthesis. And so that actually becomes positive. So now we have a problem of negative 3 plus 7 is equal to, and this actually now becomes this problem that we had up here, becomes positive 4. Okay, so here I have 7 minus a negative 4. That actually becomes plus, so I'm saying 7 plus 4 gives me 11. Same kind of thing goes on here. 9 minus a negative 4, that becomes plus, gives us 13. Here we've got a negative 9 minus a negative 7. This negative has nothing to do with this negative with the 9. That has nothing to do with the double negative rule. It's these 2 negatives where we're subtracting an already negative number. They become positive. So now it's actually negative 9 plus 8. So now you're kind of looking at man-to-man combat. What do I have more of? I have more negatives. How many more? I have one more negative. Okay, subtracting an already negative number. This becomes positive, so we have 10. Here I'm subtracting an already negative number. This becomes positive. Now I've got a case of negative 12 plus 7. Different signs. So I have man-to-man combat. What do I have more of? I have more negatives, so I know my answer is going to be negative. How many more do I have? So when I say 12 minus 7, I have 5. So our answer there would be negative 5. Here we're going to add. This becomes positive because we're subtracting an already negative number. That becomes positive. Our outcomes becomes 20. Here I have negative 7, subtracting an already negative number. This becomes positive. Now I'm looking at it. Hey, I've got different signs. Man-to-man combat. Who's going to win the battle? It's obviously going to be negatives because there's more negatives. How many more negatives? 7 minus 5 gives me 2, so that's a negative 2. So here I have negative 8 minus an already negative 8. That becomes positive. So negative 8 collected with a positive 8 gets us to 0. Okay, at the end of this worksheet or this packet, I've included an activity with positive and negatives. Looks like this. The first page, you know, there's just a ton of collecting, and that you're going to look through this and, oh, they're all the same sign. I add and keep the sign. Try to keep your head in the game and just kind of remind yourself, same sign, adding. When you come over here, these are different signs. So you're going to have to think about subtracting and which do you have more of, and then identifying the sign that way. When you get over here to the other side, you've got just a little quarter page here where you're just practicing that double negative and then applying either of the rules from the front page. And then the lower part here, you've got mixed practice. Many students may not need this, but for some of you who do, this is an opportunity for you to get this down before we go on. Okay.